What's up YouTube? Let's make acid leads with phase plant. So I've mentioned in various videos that I do think the best way to create like an exact TB303 style sound is using D16 for Zion. But for those who don't have that plugin and you have phase plant, there are a couple of interesting ways of recreating something that comes pretty close. So like I said, it's not exact, but it comes pretty close, and you can actually take things a little bit further in terms of sound design because of the open-ended nature of phase plant. So I think it's pretty interesting to discuss some techniques for creating these kind of like acid leads. Let's dive into it. I've got this track here that I've been working on, and I've got like a lead sound that I'm kind of auditioning with a couple of different sounds, and the progression of the lead is kind of like pushing me towards creating a kind of like acid sound for various reasons. And I think these are actually important elements in creating a kind of like acidy lead sound, is having a couple of these sort of parameters in the way that you write the MIDI. It definitely helps to have these varying velocities, as well as having some parts where you have portamentos or glides, where the notes are overlapping. You know, those two parameters are kind of very much part of the, you know, the characteristics of a TB303, is the accent and glide of the different notes. So, okay, we've discussed that. You can go ahead and copy this MIDI if you want. It is also transposed, I believe, by +3. So let's go ahead and do that. Cool. I should have a blank instance loaded here. Yep. And we can dive in and start discussing various parameters that I think are important to the kind of 303 or acid sound. So straight off the bat, I'm going to add an analog oscillator. And one of the coolest things about phase plant is this kind of visual readout that you get of your waveform at each of the stages. So let's say, for example, we add in a filter. We're doing something like a high pass filter at 20 hertz. And, you know, even though those types of things are probably going to be inaudible, you can actually see there's like a slight difference in the waveform happening over here. So, you know, being able to kind of craft your waveform around this kind of like visual parameter makes things very, very easy. You know, if you have in mind a specific waveform that you're kind of trying to build. And, you know, one thing that, you know, those who may have done some research on this and stuff, you know, some of these older Roland stuff like the TB303, the saw wave waveform isn't exactly linear like this. It has actually got a little bit of roundedness happening over here. And I believe that's due to kind of like the DC filters that they've built into the actual synths kind of schematic. I'm not an expert on that, but I do know that the TB303's waveform is a little bit rounded like that. And I found the closest way to get it like exact is to set this cutoff somewhere around 35 hertz or so. So it's not too drastic, and a kind of like medium to low Q factor. So it's just a little bit curved like that, and then it kind of like dips down back to the 0 point like this. I also set it to a slope of 2. As you can see, the more you slope it, the more drastic that kind of like curve on the top gets. So let's go with a slope of 2. And another thing that's important about the kind of like TB303 sound, or the kind of acid sound, is it doesn't have much top end. You know, as much as you turn the filter all the way up, it doesn't go into the kind of like 20 hertz range. I think because the synth is designed to synthesize bass sounds. So it's important, you know, before getting into the actual filtration side of things, we're thinking now in terms of like, if we have to think about, you know, building a schematic for a synthesizer, we're kind of building the oscillator section, and we're not using these filters as traditional filters like sweeps, like bow, 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 you know, to create those kind of acid sounds. These filters we're kind of using in more of an EQ type of fashion to kind of like create a basic waveform, which we then pass into the effects section, which we're going to apply filters and stuff to get closer to that kind of like acid sound, or at least the movement in the acid sound. But in the generator section, I'm kind of just concentrating more on recreating that exact waveform as I believe it is in the 303. So with this filter, what I want to do is I want to create a bit of a boost in the mid-range. So let's set this to the peak over here, and we can just gain it up a little bit and sweep it around. I found I went with like a 880 hertz, somewhere around there. It felt like there was a bit of a boost in the mid-range. And finally, I put on another filter and set this to high shelf, and just use this to carve out a little bit of that top end from the synth so it's not so bright. So this was about 800 or something hertz. Like I said, we can go back in here and kind of fine tune these to get, more specific or closer to the actual sound itself. So you see, as you kind of like tweak these parameters, you can kind of carve this waveform exactly how you want it, So this is pretty cool for, recreating sounds that like recreating, for example, like a waveform that you have in your head or something like that. So here what we can do is we can set this polyphony down to 1. We want to turn on legato, because again, that's another characteristic of the acid sound. And let's hit glide on, and again, switch this to legato. So it's only going to glide the notes that are overlapping, rather than always which glides in between every note, if that makes sense. So this should be closer to what we're looking for. Okay, so I think that's about it for the generator section, or at least for crafting the kind of waveform. Now let's look at the ladder filter, which is, for those who don't know, the filter inside of 303 is actually designed slightly differently. It's called a ladder filter because it actually, if you look at the circuit, it physically looks like a ladder. They've kind of placed the components, up and down and side to side in a fashion that looks like a ladder. I believe a Moog synth is designed similarly to this topology, I believe they call it. So basically, I believe the transistor ladder is a Moog, and the diode ladder is the kind of like Roland TB303 style filter. So using this, we can kind of get a little bit closer to that acidy sound. So what we can do is let's add in a couple of modulators here. So like I said before, something that's very important to the sound or the characteristics of the TB303 or acid sound is velocity, and then also very sharp envelopes to kind of emulate a plucky sound. So I like to create 2 envelopes, one being much shorter than the other, and this way you're able to get like a really, really plucky sound and slightly more control that way. Check this out. So if we have just one envelope, so what I do then is the second envelope, which is kind of like much tighter, I'll set this velocity to modulate the, how can I say, they call it the sidechain input of this second envelope modulator. So what happens is as the velocity gets higher, it sends more of this modulation through to that cutoff. So when there's full velocity, it has a slightly more bite on the sound. So then here, let's also set some velocity to the cutoff itself, and we can turn this down a bit so we can kind of find the sweet spot in between those 2 parameters. And then I find there's also a little bit of kind of pluckiness on the actual resonance parameter itself. And this is generally, I don't think that the sound of the 303, the resonance kind of like ever hits 0, if that makes sense. So I always kind of like add quite a bit of this to accentuate that kind of like buzzy, acidic sound. So here, you see what happens if, for example, we set a macro to control this decay of this first envelope. It's not going to change the kind of like accented pluck, if that makes sense. It's not going to change the decay of that accented pluck. So we get the same kind of like transient on each hit, if that makes sense. But we have control over the kind of like how the motion of how that sound kind of opens after that first transient. Then we can also set a parameter to modulate the amount of envelope that gets sent through to the filter. So let's call this FENV, filter envelope. And we can set it to this one as well a little bit, but not all the way. So let's go down, just so that there's less of that transient when it's down. Then let's set another parameter here to be the actual, filter sweep. Filter. So really another cool trick is, so let's say, for example, we'll turn the glide down to 0. The characteristic of the kind of acid or 303 sound is to have kind of very minimal sustain. So it's just a kind of like plucky sound. Something more like this. But the problem then is when you turn the kind of like portamento or glide up, it kind of don't get that slidiness. So what I like to do is set a macro to control the glide and the sustain of that oscillator. So as you turn the glide up, the sustain goes up, so you get that slidey motion. Check this out. So I'm just going to EQ this to fit in a little bit with the track. I'm going to put on a high pass filter of about 250, okay, 266, whatever. Okay, maybe a bit lower. Let's go somewhere like 170. Okay, so that's the basis of it, but there are various ways I like to take this into, slightly more experimental or, kind of play with it a little bit. So we could create either, kind of multi-band distortion system using multipass, or we could create a kind of like echoey delay system using snap heap. So first and foremost, I want to go into creating a kind of like delay thing with snap heap. I have kind of outlined a very similar thing to this technique before, but I'm going to quickly just go through it again. So let's add a delay, switch this to sync, ping pong, pan all the way. So now it's a traditional ping pong delay. Now what I want to do is I want to turn the mix all the way up and then the mix of the lane down. So what we can do here is any effects that we apply here is on the tail of the delay, but then we're mixing the original back in again. So here what we can do is we can add filters like low pass, high pass to kind of like carve out a kind of like slightly different tone for the tail of the delay sound. And let's maybe add like some reverb to the tail as well. I think that could be interesting. So here what I like to do is use these envelope inputs to kind of modulate the amount of delay and kind of reverb that's happening. So we can kind of create a sidechain effect. So every time the synth kind of hits, we get less of the effect, if that makes sense. Let's apply this envelope parameter to the mix like this. So you see every time the note hits, it kind of like ducks the effect away, and then as the synth stops playing, it kind of like comes with that effect back in again. So the trick is to kind of like get the balance of the two. So let's look at creating a multiband distortion saturation thing. So this is going to be just before those effects and stuff. So I'm just going to go wild here and experiment a little bit and see what we come up with. So let's just put different distortions on each of these layers. I'm going to leave the subs coming through clean. I'm probably, they're getting EQ'd out in the channel anyway, so I don't think it's going to make all that much difference. So yeah, let's just see how this goes. Awesome. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope that gave you plenty of ideas, to get experimental with and recreate these types of sounds in Faceplant. I'm going to be uploading this preset to my Patreon for all my $5 supporters. So if you want to know what that's all about, check out the link that's going to be in the description. And yeah, as always, if you haven't yet, please consider hitting that subscribe button. And if you liked the video, hit that like button and also let me know in the comments so I know to make more of this type of thing. See you guys next time. Cheers.